The penthouse shimmered with an icy perfection that always made Violet feel like a smudge on a spotless window pane. Every surface gleamed, reflecting the winter light from outside, a stark contrast to the cozy, slightly messy classroom she secretly longed for. At 23, she was Violet Vance, a maid in a gilded cage far removed from the princess she was meant to be, or the kindergarten teacher she dreamed of becoming. Her current existence was a desperate, precarious act, a runaway hiding in plain sight, entirely dependent on the man who owned this cold palace in the sky. She moved with practiced quiet, dusting a glass coffee table, but her mind drifted. Later, tucked away in the tiny maid's room, she would retrieve the tarnished silver tiara from its shoebox, polishing it slowly, remembering the weight of it, the crown she'd fled. A forced political marriage, a life of duty and no love, had driven her here, to this harsh, beautiful prison. All she craved was simple freedom, a love untainted by power, but for now, survival meant scrubbing floors and trying not to break anything. A sudden shift in the air, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the Chicago winter, warned her. Zane Wolfe had arrived. She didn't need to see him. She felt his presence like a physical force, a silent tremor through the expensive flooring. Zane, at 37, was not merely a man. He was an edifice, a towering figure of brutal efficiency who commanded a global empire. His shadow seemed to fall over her even before he stepped fully into the living area. Violet's heart hammered against her ribs. She was still holding a delicate porcelain teacup, one of a ridiculously expensive set he kept for show. Her hands, usually steady, now trembled. He didn't speak, didn't even glance her way at first, but his cold disdain was palpable. She could feel his eyes on her, a silent evaluation that stripped her down to her clumsy, disposable maid status. She wanted to disappear. Her fingers tightened, then slipped. The teacup tumbled from her grasp, a slow-motion nightmare. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, sickening crack, shattering into several pristine white pieces. The sound echoed in the vast, silent penthouse, a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. Violet froze, her breath hitched, a silent apology forming on her lips. She dared to look up. Zane stood framed in the archway, his dark eyes narrowed, a storm brewing behind their depthless surface. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid. For a moment, she expected the scathing words, the instant dismissal that was his trademark. He had fired staff for less. She braced herself for the inevitable, for the public humiliation and the sudden end to her tenuous security. Instead, his voice, when it came, was a low rumble, devoid of overt anger, yet more terrifying for its controlled calm. "That will be deducted from your next pay, Violet." His words were a blunt assertion of absolute authority, a swift, decisive blow without any theatricality. A maid who cannot hold a teacup is a liability. See that it doesn't happen again. Her shoulders slumped, a wave of relief, then shame washing over her. She wasn't fired, she was merely chastised, controlled, and reminded of her place. Her meager earnings, already barely enough, would be even less. But even amidst the sting of his words, the humiliation of her clumsiness, Violet felt a strange, almost unsettling sense of contained chaos. His cold control, his brutal efficiency, somehow kept the larger, more dangerous world at bay. In his presence, despite his cruelty, she was oddly, paradoxically, safe. His domain, harsh as it was a fragile shield, protecting her hidden life from the storm raging outside. She swallowed, her gaze fixed on the shattered porcelain. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The shattered teacup lay on the marble, a stark white testament to Violet's clumsiness, mirroring the fragility of her current existence. Zane Wolfe had left as swiftly as he'd appeared, his presence receding like a cold front. leaving behind an unsettling silence. Violet knelt, carefully gathering the shards, each piece a sharp reminder of his words. "That will be deducted from your next pay." The sting of the deduction was real. A financial blow she could ill afford, but a wave of profound relief washed over her. She hadn't been fired. She was still here, still hidden, still under the imposing roof of the man who held her precarious future in his perfectly manicured hands. She swept the last speck of porcelain into a dustpan, her gaze sweeping over the penthouse. Every line, every polished surface, every minimalist piece of art screamed Zane. It was a fortress of glass and steel, cold and unyielding, yet impeccably maintained. It reflected his brutal efficiency, his demand for perfection, his absolute control. And now she was a small, almost invisible part of it. Later that evening, as Violet prepared a light supper for him, he reappeared, leaning against the doorway of the kitchen, a dark silhouette against the softer light of the hallway. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His tone was level, each word a command carved in stone. "From now on, Violet, your schedule will be mine. My meetings often run late, my needs are unpredictable. You will be available. Absolute precision in all tasks. No more accidents. No more disruptions. When I am present, you will be silent, invisible unless summoned." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, a thorough, unnerving assessment. "Is that clear?" Violet's heart tightened, a knot of humiliation and a strange, burgeoning awareness. Her personal time, already minimal, would now cease to exist. Her life would revolve around his whims, a satellite in his orbit. The quiet moments she'd stolen for herself, the small freedoms, were now gone. Yet, as she met his unwavering stare, she felt a peculiar sense of inevitability. This was his domain, and these were his rules. She was a guest, a servant, and her survival depended on her absolute adherence. There was a stark, undeniable clarity in his demands, a rigid structure that, while stifling, also felt oddly protective. She wouldn't have to worry about the outside world, about the dangers she'd fled. Here, under his watchful eye, she would be contained, controlled, and in a strange way, safe. "Yes, sir," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "It's clear." She began to adapt, a silent phantom moving through his penthouse. She learned the exact moment to refresh his coffee, the precise temperature of his bathwater, the subtle cues that signaled his mood. She anticipated his needs before he articulated them, her gentle nature unconsciously molding itself to the harsh contours of his routine. She found a peculiar, albeit uncomfortable, security in this rigid structure. His demands, though absolute, were predictable. Her life, though stifled, held a strange stability in its constraint. It was a cage, yes, but a well-fortified one. One afternoon, while meticulously dusting the formidable mahogany desk in his private study, Violet accidentally brushed against a stack of documents. A thin, embossed folder slid from the pile, its contents a dense tangle of legal jargon and financial figures detailing his global conglomerate's dealings. Before she could even register the words, a shadow fell over her. Zane was there, silent as ever, his eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His hand moved with lightning speed, snatching the folder from where it had fallen, his fingers brushing hers, sending a jolt through her. He tucked it back into the stack with a decisive thump, his gaze sharp and possessive. It wasn't just anger she saw, but a fierce, almost primal protectiveness of his world, his secrets. He might be harsh, cruel even, but he permitted no intrusion, no external threat to penetrate his fortress. His domain, where she now resided, was fiercely guarded. In that swift, almost aggressive gesture, Violet understood. She was a part of his space now, his liability, and as such, she was implicitly under his severe, unyielding protection. He might own her time, her labor, and her peace, but in return, he offered an impenetrable shield against everything else. Weeks bled into a monotonous rhythm of polished surfaces and hushed movements. Violet settled into the demanding routine, a silent, efficient presence in Zane Wolfe's stark penthouse. The initial terror that had gripped her in those first days, the constant fear of another misstep, had slowly receded, replaced by a quiet, almost meditative efficiency. She mastered the intricate espresso machine, learning his exact preference. The aroma, a familiar comfort in the sterile kitchen. She knew the precise temperature of his bathwater, the perfect angle for his tie, the subtle shift in his mood that signaled a need for silence or for a particular blend of tea. She moved through the vast, cold expanse of his home like a ghost, her gentle nature a stark, almost defiant contrast to the unforgiving glass and steel that surrounded her. She observed Zane from a distance, a figure of relentless, almost inhuman focus. She saw him hunched over glowing screens late into the night, the only sound the quiet tap of his fingers. She watched him eat solitary meals at the long, empty dining table, his expression unreadable, his presence filling the room with an unspoken command. He was an enigma, a force of nature contained within the walls of his own making, and she, a tiny satellite, orbited his formidable presence. His sharp remarks continued, cutting through the silence like shards of ice, but they became less effective, their edges blunted by her quiet resignation. Clumsy, he might grunt, or inefficient, but she would merely offer a soft, "Yes, sir," or "Right away, sir." Her vulnerability now a quiet strength, a shield against his verbal blows. There was no point in arguing, no space for defiance. This was his world, and she was merely a component, expected to function flawlessly. A strange, paradoxical comfort began to settle within her. In his strictness, in the absolute, unyielding control he exerted over every aspect of her life within these walls, she found a peculiar kind of safety. She didn't have to make decisions. She didn't have to navigate the treacherous currents of the world she had fled. Her life, though stifled, felt stable and predictable in its constraint. Every command, every expectation was a boundary, a clear line drawn around her existence. Inside those lines, harsh as they were, she was protected. The cage might be gilded, but it was also incredibly strong, impenetrable. She felt herself unconsciously adapting, her own quiet will bending to his, finding a strange peace in the surrender. Zane, though still outwardly cold, a man carved from ice and ambition, began to exhibit subtle changes. Violet, ever observant, noticed them. There were moments fleeting and unacknowledged, when his gaze would linger a fraction of a second longer as she moved past him with his freshly brewed coffee, or when he would pause, his head tilted almost imperceptibly, as she quietly organized his chaotic desk. He never acknowledged these observations, never offered a word of praise or softening, yet she felt it. His demands, while still absolute, became marginally less frequent. His temper a fraction less volatile, specifically towards her. It was as if her quiet efficiency, her unwavering compliance, had, against all odds, carved out a tiny, almost invisible space of acceptance within his formidable walls. She was still under his thumb, still a maid, but she was his maid, and in his strange, silent way, he was beginning to claim her, not just as an employee, but as a part of his meticulously ordered world. A harsh Chicago winter storm descended, turning the city into a swirling vortex of white and gray. Outside the penthouse, the world raged, a chaotic symphony of wind and pelting snow. Inside, however, Zane Wolfe's domain remained an island of controlled calm, albeit a cold one. The storm, fierce and relentless, isolated them, sealing them within the glass and steel fortress high above the city. The usual hum of the city was muffled, replaced by the persistent, distant howl of the wind, making the silence within the penthouse feel even more profound. Violet moved through the evening shadows, a cup of steaming herbal tea in her hands. Zane was in his study, a room usually off-limits unless specifically commanded. But tonight, with the city paralyzed, the rules bent just slightly. The only light in the vast space came from the glow of his multiple computer screens, casting a cold, blue-white luminescence over his face. He was hunched over his desk, completely absorbed, a formidable figure even in stillness. The air around him crackled with a silent intensity, the energy of a man who never ceased to command, even when alone. She approached cautiously, her footsteps barely audible on the plush rug. The storm outside seemed to demand a slower pace, a quiet reverence for the forces at play. As she drew nearer, she saw him more clearly than she ever had before. The sharp angles of his face were softened marginally by the artificial light, revealing faint lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. His tie was loosened, the top button of his shirt undone. For a fleeting moment, she saw not the impenetrable CEO, but a man burdened, relentless, and undeniably human. It was a glimpse behind the steel, a rare fissure in his perfectly constructed facade. She placed the tea silently on a coaster beside his hand, her gaze lingering for a second too long. A heavy cashmere blanket, usually folded neatly over a chairback, had slipped, pooling around his legs. It seemed an almost unconscious maternal instinct guided her hand. Without thinking, without permission, she reached out, a soft, gentle motion to adjust the blanket, drawing it up higher over his shoulders. It was a small, tender gesture, born of an empathy she couldn't suppress, a momentary forgetting of their rigid boundaries. His head snapped up, his eyes, dark and sharp, instantly locking onto hers. The suddenness of his movement made her flinch, her hand recoiling as if burned. The fleeting glimpse of humanity vanished, replaced by the familiar, unnerving intensity. She immediately retreated a step, her heart hammering, a silent apology forming on her lips. She had overstepped, intruded on his space, on his focus. She braced herself for the reprimand, for the familiar sting of his displeasure, the sharp reminder of her place. But it didn't come. He simply held her gaze for a long, unsettling moment, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes flickered to the blanket, then back to her. A muscle in his jaw clenched, then relaxed. He didn't speak, didn't demand an explanation, didn't fire her. Instead, he merely offered a curt, almost imperceptible nod, a rare, non-hostile acknowledgement of her presence, of her action. It was a concession, however minor, that left her breathless. Violet felt a strange, almost magnetic pull to his contained power, a paradox she couldn't quite decipher. The storm outside raged, a terrifying, untamed force, threatening the very foundations of the city. Yet within these walls, under his vigilant if harsh control, she felt an overwhelming sense of security. His presence, his unwavering authority, was an anchor against the chaos. In the face of the howling wind and the unseen dangers that lurked in the world, his controlled environment felt like the safest place she could possibly be. She realized, with a jolt that was both humbling and oddly comforting, that she had begun to trust his protection, even if it came in the form of a cage. She was his entirely, and in that absolute ownership she found a strange, undeniable peace. The city outside was a jarring symphony of blaring horns and distant sirens, a chaotic counterpoint to the hushed, sterile perfection of Zane's penthouse. Violet, unaccustomed to the bustling streets, clutched the small, expensive leather bag containing Zane's dry cleaning receipt. It was a rare excursion, a mundane task, yet it felt like a perilous journey through a foreign land. The sleek black car, one of Zane's many, had dropped her precisely at the curb, and she felt its absence keenly as she stepped onto the crowded pavement. Her senses, dulled by weeks of quiet efficiency, were overwhelmed by the sheer press of humanity. The hurried footsteps, the cacophony of voices. She moved quickly, her head down, a small, inconspicuous figure amidst the towering buildings and rushing crowds. The anonymity was both a blessing and a curse. It protected her hidden identity, but it also left her feeling utterly exposed, a fragile bird in a concrete jungle. The reminder of the forced marriage she'd fled, the threat of discovery, always lingered at the edges of her consciousness. A faint, cold whisper, a prickle of unease snaked up her spine. It wasn't just the usual city paranoia. She felt it, a subtle shift in the rhythm around her, a sense of being observed. Her steps faltered slightly as she glanced over her shoulder. A man, shifty-eyed and dressed in an ill-fitting coat, seemed to be moving with a purpose that mirrored her own, always a few paces behind, never quite catching up, yet never falling away. Her heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He wasn't just a passerby. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her carefully constructed calm. This wasn't the contained, predictable harshness of Zane's penthouse. This was the wild, unpredictable danger she had fled, catching up to her. Just as the figure quickened his pace, his eyes locking onto hers with an unnerving intensity, a blur of polished black metal glided to a silent stop beside her. It wasn't Zane's usual car, but it bore the same unmistakable aura of expensive, custom-built security. The rear door opened smoothly. A burly, silent man whose presence radiated quiet strength stepped out. He didn't speak, didn't offer an explanation. His gaze, devoid of emotion, simply met hers, then gestured subtly but insistently towards the open door. Violet didn't hesitate. Relief, profound and dizzying, washed over her as she slipped into the plush leather interior. The door closed with a soft thud, sealing her away from the jostling crowd, from the shifty-eyed man, from the overwhelming chaos of the city. The car pulled away, smooth and silent, taking her directly back to the only place she now felt truly safe, Zane Wolfe's impenetrable domain. Zane was already home, standing by the panoramic window, a dark, imposing silhouette against the cityscape. He turned as she entered, his expression impassive, unreadable. He didn't ask about her errand. He didn't mention the car or the man or the swift, almost surgical intervention that had plucked her from the street. She didn't speak of it either, the memory of the close call still a tremor in her hands. It was as if the incident simply hadn't happened, a silent agreement of unacknowledged protection. That evening, however, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and deep orange, Violet noticed subtle changes. Additional security cameras, sleek and almost invisible, were being installed at strategic points around the penthouse, their lenses like watchful, unblinking eyes. The guards in the lobby seemed more numerous, their presence more vigilant. Zane's gaze, when it fell upon her, held a new, almost possessive intensity, a silent declaration of ownership that sent a shiver down her spine. He finally spoke, his voice low, cutting through the quiet hum of the penthouse. He didn't say, "I'm protecting you." He wouldn't. Instead, his words were a blunt statement of fact, devoid of warmth, yet resonating with an undeniable weight. "You are a liability," he stated, his eyes fixed on her, "if you cannot return safely." The declaration, though harsh, settled deep within her. A truth she couldn't deny. She was a liability, but in that very statement she also understood something profound. She was his liability, and because she was his, he would handle it. He would ensure her safety, not out of kindness, but out of a fierce, unyielding need for control over his own environment, his own possessions. Violet felt her growing dependence solidify into an almost unbreakable bond. There was a strange, undeniable comfort in this implicit protection. He might demand absolute obedience, might control her every move within these walls, but in return he offered an impenetrable shield. She instinctively understood that he had taken absolute responsibility for her safety, making it his own problem. his own domain. She looked at him, towering and formidable, and a quiet sense of acceptance settled over her. This was her place now, within his sphere of control, under his unyielding, silent protection. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt truly, irrevocably safe. The polished marble of Zane Wolfe's corporate lobby was a world away from the quiet solitude of his penthouse. Here, wealth and power converged, a symphony of hushed conversations, expensive fabrics, and the subtle scent of ambition. Violet, clutching a slim leather portfolio containing Zane's presentation documents, felt acutely out of place. She was dressed in the understated uniform of a maid, a stark contrast to the tailored suits and glittering jewelry that surrounded them. Her presence here was an extension of Zane's will, a task she performed with the same quiet efficiency she displayed in his home. But the sheer number of eyes, the sheer noise of so many important people, made her feel exposed, vulnerable. Zane moved through the crowd like a king among courtiers, his height and imposing presence commanding deference without a single spoken word. He was a dark, formidable anchor in the swirling chaos of the lobby, and Violet, walking a respectful half-step behind him, found herself relying on his formidable silhouette to shield her from the overwhelming attention. She kept her gaze down, her focus on the polished floor, aware of his every movement, every subtle shift in his posture. He paused, turning slightly to address a silver-haired executive, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried authority effortlessly. For a brief moment, his formidable back was no longer a complete shield. Violet felt a sudden, inexplicable prickle of unease, a familiar premonition of danger she hadn't felt since her days in the palace. Her grip tightened on the portfolio. Then, a sudden, jarring commotion erupted. It wasn't a polite murmur or a spilled drink. It was a sharp, guttural shout, a violent disruption in the carefully orchestrated calm. Two figures, disguised in the bland uniforms of delivery personnel, burst from behind a large potted palm, moving with a speed that belied their bulky packages. Their eyes, wild and desperate, locked onto Violet. "There she is!" one of them roared, his voice thick with a guttural accent she vaguely recognized. Before she could even fully comprehend the words, a hand, surprisingly strong, grabbed her arm. Terror, cold and absolute, seized her. This was it. The world she'd fled, the danger she'd hidden from, had finally caught up. Her breath hitched, a silent scream trapped in her throat. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for Zane, for anything. And then, a faint, almost ethereal blue light began to pulse from her left wrist, directly beneath the sleeve of her uniform. It was her royal security chip, embedded beneath her skin years ago, designed to activate under duress, a last-ditch failsafe. The soft glow, though quickly fading, was unmistakable in the dimming light of the lobby, a silent, damning beacon revealing her true identity. Zane's reaction was blindingly fast. One moment he was speaking calmly to the executive, the next he was a blur of dark motion. He didn't hesitate, didn't think. He simply moved. His large hand clamped around her shoulder, yanking her violently backwards, shoving her behind him with a force that left her breathless. His body, hard and unyielding, became an instant impenetrable wall between her and the attackers. "Security!" His voice wasn't a shout, but a low, dangerous growl that cut through the sudden panic spreading through the lobby. It was a sound of absolute command, a primal warning. His security detail, a group of men she barely noticed until now, materialized as if from the very air, their movements swift and brutal. They descended on the would-be kidnappers with terrifying efficiency, a whirlwind of precise strikes and restrained force. The two men were subdued in a matter of seconds, their struggling muffled, their packages falling to reveal nothing but empty boxes. But before they were dragged away, one of them, his face contorted in a snarl, managed to shout, his voice echoing in the now stunned silence of the lobby, "The princess! We have the princess!" The words hung in the air, cold and undeniable. A ripple of gasps and whispers spread through the shocked crowd, their eyes now fixed on Violet, who was still pressed tightly against Zane's unyielding back, his body her only shield. The faint blue light on her wrist had long since vanished, but the damage was done. Her secret, her carefully constructed lie, was shattered. Zane stood unmoving, his breath a steady, powerful rhythm against her back. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head, his cold gaze falling on her. His eyes, usually pools of impassive ice, were now a storm brewing, dark and turbulent, filled with an intensity she had never seen before. He looked at her, truly saw her, and in that gaze, she knew everything had changed. The maid was gone, the princess was exposed, and the world, once held at bay by his formidable will, was about to come crashing down. Yet, even in the terrifying exposure, pressed against his broad, solid back, she felt an inexplicable, raw sense of safety. He was her fortress, even if he now knew her greatest secret. The journey back to the penthouse was a silent, suffocating blur. Violet sat rigidly in the back seat of Zane's car, the memory of the lobby incident replaying in a horrifying loop. The shouts, the grab, the flash of blue light from her wrist. It had all happened so fast, yet the consequences were monumental. Her secret, the very foundation of her precarious existence, was shattered. Now, exposed and terrified, she was being escorted not by a captor, but by a man who now knew exactly who she was, a man whose cold fury she could practically feel radiating from the driver's seat. The moment the penthouse doors closed behind them, the silence became absolute, heavier than any she had ever experienced in his presence. Zane didn't immediately speak. He simply stood in the center of the living room, a dark, imposing silhouette against the city lights, his back to her. The air crackled with a tension that threatened to suffocate her. Violet stood rooted to the spot, trembling, unable to look away from his rigid posture. Then he slowly turned. In his hand, held carefully between his thumb and forefinger, was the tarnished silver tiara. The one she kept hidden in a shoebox, the one she polished in secret, a relic of the life she'd fled. Her breath hitched. He had found it. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone, but his dark eyes burned with an intensity that stripped her bare. "Princess Violetta of Eldoria," he stated, his voice a low growl, devoid of any warmth, yet laced with a chilling undercurrent of controlled fury. It wasn't a question, it was a declaration, a brutal unveiling. He took a slow, deliberate step towards her, then another. "Do you have anything else to hide, maid?" The word was a whip, stinging with contempt and betrayal. Violet's carefully constructed composure crumbled. Shame, fear, and a desperate sense of loss washed over her. She couldn't meet his gaze. Her shoulders slumped, and the words, choked and broken, spilled out. She told him everything: the forced political marriage, the escape, her longing for a simple life, her desperate attempt to hide in plain sight. Each confession was a fresh wound, but she couldn't stop. His presence, his unwavering stare, demanded the truth, and she found herself compelled to give it, her voice barely above a whisper. When she finally finished, the penthouse was silent once more, save for her ragged breathing. Zane listened, impassive, his gaze never leaving her face. He didn't offer comfort, didn't show a flicker of sympathy. He simply absorbed her words, processing them with the same brutal efficiency he applied to his business dealings. Then he spoke, and his words were a shock that left her reeling. "I knew you were being targeted," he said, his voice flat, emotionless, "though I didn't know why." He tossed the tiara onto a nearby glass table, the soft clink echoing ominously. A corrupt security firm was selling information on a high-value, unidentified female. I bought them out. Took a financial hit, but it was a loose end. a potential threat to my own carefully constructed environment. I needed it secured, off the market. Violet stared at him, stunned. He had known. He had been protecting her, quietly, unknowingly, even before she was anything more than his clumsy maid. The realization was both terrifying and profoundly unsettling. He hadn't protected her, not as a person, but as a problem, a variable that could disrupt his meticulously ordered world. His ruthlessness was breathtaking, but so was the sheer scale of his foresight, his silent, almost aggressive protection of his own domain. His eyes, now cold and calculating, swept over her, no longer seeing a disposable servant, but a high-value hostage, as he'd put it. "This changes everything," he stated, his voice snapping her back to the grim reality. "You are no longer a maid, you are a target, and you are now my responsibility." The penthouse, already a fortress, began to transform around her. Within hours, new layers of security materialized. Men in dark suits, more numerous and heavily armed than before, moved silently through the halls. Screens displaying complex surveillance grids appeared in a previously empty room, transforming it into a command center. Zane, a man now entirely consumed by the new threat, became her jailer and her protector, all at once. He laid out his plan, his voice cutting through the fear that gripped her. "You will not leave this penthouse. You will not speak to anyone without my express permission. Your communication will be monitored. You are to follow every instruction without question, without delay." His gaze was absolute, demanding total submission. "Is that clear, Violet?" Her world had shrunk to these walls, to his commands. Her freedom, the very thing she had fled for, was gone, replaced by an even tighter cage. Yet, as she looked at him, at the formidable man who had taken control, who was mobilizing his entire empire to protect her, a strange sense of quiet calm settled over her. He was building an impenetrable fortress around her, and in his fierce, unyielding control, she felt a paradoxical safety. He was her shield, her prison, and her only hope. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but firm. It was a surrender, an acknowledgement of his absolute dominance, and a desperate plea for the protection only he could provide. The penthouse, once a harsh but familiar cage, had transformed into an even tighter prison. Violet moved within its glass walls, every step monitored, every action observed. The outside world, usually a distant hum, now roared with her name. News reports, flickering across the large screens Zane had commandeered for surveillance, spoke of an attempted kidnapping, of rumors of a runaway princess, of a kingdom in turmoil. Her face, once carefully hidden, was now plastered across international headlines, a ghost from a past she had desperately tried to outrun. Zane, a man possessed by a new, grim purpose, allowed her no solitude. He worked relentlessly in the makeshift command center, his voice a constant low murmur of commands into various devices. He brought her intelligence reports, his large hands spreading out printouts across a sleek table, photos of hardened faces, insignias of shadowy mercenary groups, intricate maps marked with potential threats. Each image was a fresh wave of terror. These were not the polite, scheming courtiers she had known. These were predators, and they were all hunting her. The sheer scale of the danger was paralyzing. Her breath hitched, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. She saw the ruthlessness in their eyes, the explicit desire to claim her, to use her as a pawn in their brutal games. She watched Zane, a formidable figure of calm amidst the storm of information, dissecting each threat with chilling precision. His efficiency, once intimidating, now stirred a strange sense of awe within her. He was a general, orchestrating a war with her as the prize, and she, the terrified pawn, could only watch and obey. One evening, as the city lights twinkled far below, Zane held up a single encrypted data chip. His expression was grimmer than usual, a subtle tightening around his jaw. He spoke without preamble, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. This came through a compromised channel, a coded message intended for a rebel cell. He paused, his gaze fixed on the chip, then on her. It details a plan for your capture, to be used as leverage against your family. The orchestrator is your uncle, through a corrupt minister he controls. The words hit Violet like a physical blow. Her uncle, the man who was supposed to protect her, who had sent her away for a safe marriage, was the very one plotting her downfall, intending to seize the throne using her as a bargaining chip. The betrayal was absolute, a gaping wound in her already fragile sense of security. Her family, her blood, had become the most dangerous threat of all. The world tilted, her last anchor to any semblance of normalcy snapping. She felt utterly alone, completely adrift. But then, her gaze drifted from the horrifying news to the man before her. Zane. He was her captor, her commander, the man who had bullied her. Yet he was also the one who had seen the threat before she even knew it existed, who had bought out a corrupt firm to protect her location, who was now dedicating his entire empire to her defense. With her family a betrayal and the world a predator, Zane Wolfe, the cold CEO, was her only anchor. She had no choice. She looked at him, truly looked at him, not as a tyrant, but as her protector. There was a raw, undeniable power in his presence, a fierce, possessive will that promised to stand between her and every threat, and in that moment of absolute vulnerability, she chose him. She chose his control, his harshness, his formidable shield. It was a complete, unspoken surrender, born not of weakness, but of an overwhelming need for safety. He must have seen the dawning realization in her eyes, the silent shift in her resolve. Without a word, he turned, his broad shoulders momentarily obscuring her view. He returned with his black overcoat, the heavy wool smelling faintly of expensive cologne and the cold winter air. He draped it around her shoulders, the dark fabric enveloping her, its weight a comforting pressure. It was a silent, powerful gesture, a physical manifestation of his claim, his promise of protection. She shivered, but not from cold. It was from the undeniable truth that in his fierce, unyielding embrace, she was finally irrevocably safe. The penthouse, once a symbol of Zane's cold dominance, had become a fortress under siege. The outside world, now fully aware of Princess Violetta of Eldoria's presence, pounded at its defenses with relentless, insidious attacks. The sleek, silent screens in the command center flickered with red alerts, fake delivery attempts, brazenly trying to breach the fortified lobby, sophisticated hacking attempts, probing Zane's impenetrable firewalls, even suspicious aircraft, tiny blips on radar, circling the airspace at impossible altitudes before being warned off by his private security. The danger was no longer a distant whisper. It was a constant, deafening roar, and Violet felt its vibrations deep in her bones. Zane Wolfe was a man transformed. The already formidable CEO shed any pretense of his corporate persona, revealing a primal, fiercely protective animal. Sleep seemed to be a forgotten luxury. He moved through the penthouse like a coiled spring, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp and unblinking, missing nothing. He personally oversaw every detail, every patrol route, every system update. He barked orders into secure comms, his voice a low, menacing rumble that brooked no argument, no hesitation. Violet watched him, a chilling awe growing inside her. He was tearing down his own empire, diverting vast sums of money, making calls to shadowy figures in the depths of his global network, all to build an unbreachable wall around her. He was taking financial hits that would cripple lesser men. But he never hesitated, never wavered. What was his was to be protected, and she, princess or maid, was now unequivocally his. Violet, confined to the heart of this storm, found herself drawn to him, a moth to a dangerous flame. She didn't fight his control, she clung to it. The sheer scale of the threat outside made his absolute dominion within these walls feel like the only safe harbor. Her role, she instinctively understood, was not to question, but to support. She moved quietly, a soft counterpoint to his harsh efficiency. She brought him endless cups of coffee, perfectly brewed, placing them silently on his desk as he pored over schematics or barked commands. She didn't speak unless spoken to, but her presence was a constant, unwavering anchor in the periphery of his war room. Sometimes she would simply sit, curled on a plush armchair, observing him. Her gentle nature, her quiet stillness, was a stark contrast to the brutal reality he was facing, the violent lengths he was prepared to go to. She saw the lines of exhaustion deepen around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand as he ran it through his dark hair, but she also saw the unyielding resolve that fueled him. He was a force, terrifying and magnificent, and he was doing it all for her. He never acknowledged her small acts of service with words, but she felt his awareness. Occasionally his gaze would flick to her, a brief, intense glance that held a silent message she couldn't quite decipher but understood. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly, but something akin to acceptance, a recognition of her unwavering presence. She was his silent sentinel, a quiet eye in the storm he had unleashed. One night, as the alarms blared a distant warning of another attempted breach, a particularly aggressive hacking attempt, Zane's voice was colder than she'd ever heard it, his commands to his tech team brutal and unsparing. His focus was absolute, his entire being geared towards defense. Violet, witnessing his ferocity, felt a shiver, but also a profound sense of safety. He was a terrifying protector, but he was protecting her. His control, once a source of humiliation, was now her only shield. His dominance, her only solace. She realized with a startling clarity that she was becoming his emotional anchor, providing a silent, steady calm he never knew he needed, never asked for, but seemed to implicitly accept. In his world of brutal power and relentless threats, her quiet, unwavering presence offered a strange, unexpected peace. She was utterly under his command, his every decision her fate, and yet, paradoxically, she had never felt more secure. The cage was tighter than ever, but the protection it offered was absolute. The constant hum of the security systems, usually a reassuring thrum, felt like a hollow echo in Zane's absence. He had announced his departure with the same blunt efficiency he used for every command. "I'm tracking the primary mercenary cell. I'll be gone for approximately 24 hours. Mason will be in charge." His words had been devoid of emotion, yet the weight of them had settled on Violet like a stone. Mason, the security head, was a formidable, silent man, loyal to Zane. But he wasn't Zane. The moment the private jet lifted off, carrying Zane into the unknown, a cold dread began to seep into Violet's bones. The penthouse, usually an impenetrable fortress, suddenly felt less secure, its glass walls more fragile. She moved restlessly, unable to settle. Every shadow seemed deeper, every distant city sound more ominous. The world, which Zane's presence had so fiercely kept at bay, now seemed to press in on her from all sides. She had grown accustomed to his formidable shadow, to the unwavering certainty of his control, to the paradoxically comforting weight of his ownership. Without him, she felt utterly exposed, a tiny, vulnerable point in a vast, dangerous landscape. She realized with a startling clarity that both humbled and terrified her just how deeply she had come to rely on him, on his brutal strength, on his relentless will to protect what was his. The thought of him out there, in the dangerous fringes of his world, risking everything, made her stomach clench with an unfamiliar anxiety. The 24 hours stretched into an eternity. She barely ate, barely slept, her gaze constantly drawn to the large screens in the command center, as if willing his return. Mason, observing her quiet torment, offered no words of comfort, only a stoic nod when their eyes met. His presence was a shield, but it lacked the singular, absolute power of Zane's. When he finally returned, the air in the penthouse shifted. It wasn't just the sound of his footsteps, but an almost palpable change in pressure, a sudden recentering of the world. He appeared in the doorway of the command center, looking battle-hardened and weary, but undeniably successful. His dark suit was rumpled, a faint smudge of dirt on his cheek, and his eyes held a steely glint that spoke of unseen battles fought and won. He was a predator returning from the hunt, victorious. He didn't speak immediately. He simply walked to the central table, his gaze sweeping over Violet, a silent assessment. Then, with a decisive motion, he placed several items on the polished surface, a collection of small, encrypted data chips, a printout of intercepted communications filled with names and coded messages, and finally, a thick, sealed letter. The letter was made of heavy vellum, and embossed on its wax seal was a familiar, ornate crest, the official emblem of her own kingdom, her uncle's personal seal. Violet's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the evidence, her heart pounding. Zane's voice, though low and rough with exhaustion, resonated with an undeniable authority. "These are the communications. They prove the mercenary group was hired directly, their payment routed through shell companies tied to your uncle's financial network. This," he said, tapping the sealed letter with a long finger, "is a direct order, signed by him, authorizing your capture. It's irrefutable proof of his treason." The revelation was a hammer blow. Her uncle, her own blood, the man who was meant to be her protector, was her betrayer. The horror of it was overwhelming, a cold, sickening realization that shattered any lingering illusions of family loyalty. But as her gaze lifted from the damning evidence to Zane, a different emotion surged through her. He had gone into that darkness, into the dangerous, brutal fringes of his world. He had risked his life, his empire, everything, not just to secure a liability, but to uncover the truth for her. The cold CEO, who had once bullied and belittled her, was tearing down his own meticulously constructed world, facing down assassins and traitors, all to build her a new one, to ensure her safety, to unmask her enemies. He hadn't just protected her. He had fought for her, with a ferocity she now understood was born of something far deeper than mere possession. An overwhelming surge of gratitude, respect, and a nascent, terrifying love bloomed in her chest. It was a love born in the crucible of fear and absolute dependence, forged in the fires of his undeniable, uncompromising protection. He wasn't just her shield, he was her world. Without thinking, driven by an emotion too powerful to suppress, Violet reached out. Her hand, small and trembling, gently touched his arm, her fingers resting lightly on the expensive fabric of his suit. It was a tentative, comforting gesture, an offering of solace, and a silent acknowledgement of the depths of his devotion. Zane stiffened for a bare instant, a fleeting flicker of surprise in his dark eyes. He looked down at her hand, then back to her face, his gaze intense and unreadable, but he didn't pull away. He didn't reprimand her. He simply stood there, allowing her touch, a silent acceptance of the unspoken bond that had irrevocably formed between them in the crucible of unseen battlefields. The data chips Zane had brought back from his perilous journey were not mere pieces of technology. They were weapons wielded with surgical precision in a war of shadows. Violet watched from the periphery of the command center, a silent observer, as Zane orchestrated a complex, global Game of Thrones. He wasn't just fighting mercenaries now. He was battling an invisible enemy within her own kingdom, dismantling her uncle's web of corruption piece by piece. He spent hours on encrypted calls, his voice low and commanding, a constant hum of power that filled the penthouse. He moved vast amounts of information through his global network, feeding carefully curated intelligence to key, loyalist officials in Eldoria, exposing her uncle's treachery without ever directly revealing Violet's location. It was a masterclass in strategic genius, a terrifying ballet of manipulation and control, and she was at its very center. He was discrediting her uncle, turning the tide of public opinion in her kingdom, all from this glass fortress high above Chicago. The scale of his power, the intricate reach of his influence, was staggering. Violet understood little of the complex political maneuvers, the subtle shifts in allegiances he brought about, but she understood the purpose. He was fighting for her, tearing down the old regime to build her a future free from her uncle's grasp. The trust she had placed in him solidified into an unshakable certainty. She had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. He was her absolute. When he finally turned to her, his dark eyes intense, he held a sleek, secure recording device. "I need a message," he stated, his voice flat, yet holding an undeniable command. "To Royal Envoy Thorne, explain the situation, the uncle's treason, your desire for the safety of the kingdom, and that you are secure. Do not mention my name. Do not reveal your location. Your voice must be clear, convincing." Violet swallowed, a knot of nerves tightening in her stomach. It was a dangerous game, one that required her to step into the role of the princess she had fled, to address the very people she had abandoned. But Zane's gaze held no room for hesitation, no tolerance for fear. He needed this, and her role was to follow. She took a deep breath, clutching the small device. She looked at him, towering over her, his presence a solid, unyielding force. And in his gaze, she found her courage. She knew with absolute certainty that he would not ask her to do anything that would put her in further danger, not now. Her safety, her future, was inextricably linked to his control. She implicitly trusted his judgment, his strategic mind, his relentless will. He was leading, and she was following, her queen, not of a kingdom, but of his brutal, protective domain. She began to speak, her voice trembling slightly at first, but gaining strength with each word, finding the regal tone she hadn't used in years. She explained carefully, precisely, the words Zane had outlined for her, her voice clear and steady, devoid of overt emotion yet resonating with an inner conviction. She spoke of her devotion to her people, of the need for stability, of the absolute necessity to expose corruption. She felt like an actress on a stage, but the words were true, and the conviction behind them was real. Zane watched her, his expression carefully neutral, but Violet felt the subtle shift in the air, the way his gaze softened just a fraction. A flicker of something akin to admiration, rare and fleeting, touched the depths of his dark eyes. He was no longer just protecting a valuable asset, a liability that threatened his world. He was fighting for her, the woman whose quiet strength, her unwavering compliance, her surprising resilience had somehow seeped into the brutal, controlled environment of his life. She finished, her voice echoing faintly in the quiet room. She handed the device back to him, her fingers brushing his. He took it, his touch brief but firm. He didn't speak, didn't need to, but in the silent exchange, in the steady, unwavering intensity of his gaze, Violet felt the unspoken bond between them deepen, solidifying into something powerful and profound. She was his, completely and irrevocably, and in his formidable strength she found a safety that transcended any crown or kingdom. The digital map on Zane's main screen, usually a sterile display of global markets, flared with a new, terrifying urgency. Red dots, numerous and rapidly converging, pulsed around a familiar location. his isolated lakeside estate. Violet, who had been quietly preparing tea, froze mid-step. She didn't understand the complex algorithms or the military-grade encryption Zane was deciphering, but she understood the grim set of his jaw, the sudden tension in his broad shoulders. He had received new intel, and it was devastating. He didn't need to speak for her to know. Her uncle, desperate and cornered, had made his final move. He had pooled every remaining resource, every last mercenary, for a massive all-or-nothing assault. Their target, Zane's lakeside estate, was chosen for a cruel, strategic reason. They believed it to be less fortified than the impenetrable penthouse, an easier point of entry. The cold certainty of her imminent capture, the knowledge that her own blood was orchestrating this final, brutal hunt, sent a shiver through her very soul. The noose, she realized, was tightening. Zane turned, his eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto hers. There was no anger, no accusation, only a grim, unwavering determination. "We're moving," he stated, his voice a low, decisive rumble that brooked no argument. "Now." Within the hour, the penthouse was a blur of controlled chaos. Zane moved with blinding speed, barking orders, his security detail executing every command with silent precision. Violet, though terrified, felt an odd sense of calm settle over her. His absolute command, his unyielding resolve, was a powerful current that pulled her along, demanding her surrender to his will, and she gave it completely. She followed every instruction, packed the small bag he indicated, allowed herself to be ushered into the waiting armored vehicle without a word. The journey to the lakeside estate was a tense, silent affair. Outside, a light snow began to fall, dusting the winding roads and the dark skeletal trees. When they finally arrived, the snow-covered wrought-iron gate, usually a symbol of quiet grandeur, now loomed like a defiant fortress, its intricate patterns transformed into a stark, unyielding barrier. Zane immediately began to transform the estate. What was once a luxurious retreat became a war room. He personally supervised the deployment of advanced security systems, overseeing every camera, every sensor, every new layer of reinforced steel and bulletproof glass. His most elite guards, silent and formidable, moved through the grounds, their presence a palpable promise of protection. He was taking no chances. This was not just a home, it was the final bastion built around her. Violet stayed close to him, a quiet shadow, offering what little support she could. Her own fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she refused to let it show. She watched him work, his face etched with grim determination, his body moving with a tireless energy that awed her. There was a fierce, almost predatory focus in his eyes, a relentless will to protect. She felt it deeply that everything else, his global business, his formidable reputation, his vast financial empire, had become secondary. His sole, absolute focus was her. She found herself reaching out, instinctively. Sometimes her hand would rest on his arm as he spoke into a comms device, a silent offering of reassurance, a quiet acknowledgement of the immense burden he carried for her. Other times, she would simply stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his, a small, steadfast presence mirroring his own grim resolve. She was terrified, yes, but she was also completely composed. Her vulnerability hidden beneath a veneer of quiet strength, a direct reflection of the unwavering trust she placed in him. This was the final confrontation, the culmination of all the dangers she had fled, and she would face it at his side, under his command. He would sometimes glance down at her hand on his arm, or meet her gaze across the room, and in those moments his dark eyes held a silent promise, an unspoken vow that resonated deep within her. He was prepared to sacrifice everything, to unleash every ounce of his brutal power, to stand between her and every threat. She was his, completely, irrevocably, and in his fierce, unyielding protection she found a strange, profound peace. even as the storm gathered around them. The blizzard outside Zane's lakeside estate was a furious, howling beast. Snow hammered against the reinforced glass, a relentless, blinding white curtain that erased the world beyond their walls. Inside, the grand living room, usually bathed in warm light, was plunged into an eerie darkness as the power flickered, then died completely. Emergency lights, cold and stark, immediately hummed to life, casting long, unsettling shadows that danced with the frantic gusts of wind rattling the windows. Violet stood close to Zane, her hand instinctively finding his arm, feeling the coiled tension in his muscles. The silence, broken only by the storm's fury, was a heavy cloak of anticipation. They both knew this was it, the final confrontation. A shrill, piercing alarm suddenly shrieked through the estate, an electronic scream that sliced through the quiet, making Violet flinch violently. It was immediately followed by a cacophony of shattering glass from a distant wing, then the sickening thud of a breaching charge. The ground beneath her feet vibrated. They were here. Zane's grip on her arm tightened, his fingers like steel bands. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl that vibrated through her. He didn't push her, didn't force her, but the unspoken authority in his tone demanded immediate, absolute obedience. Her body instinctively responded, pressing herself against his formidable back, finding a strange solace in the hard, unyielding wall of his presence. Shapes, indistinct and menacing in the swirling snow outside, became visible through the high windows. Armed men, their dark figures like wraiths, were moving across the grounds, closing in. Shots rang out, muffled by the blizzard but undeniably close, tearing through the air with a brutal finality. The battle for Violet had begun. Zane moved not with panic, but with a terrifying primal grace. He was no longer the CEO, he was a predator unleashed, every muscle taut, every sense honed. He pulled her swiftly, decisively, towards a thick, load-bearing stone wall, the oldest part of the estate, a solid bastion against the chaos. He pressed her firmly against the rough-hewn stone, his large body a shield, completely covering her. He was between her and everything, a formidable barrier of flesh and bone and brutal will. He didn't speak, but his presence was a thunderous command. She could feel the vibration of his chest against her back, the rapid, powerful beat of his heart. He was a force of precise, lethal violence. Even pinned behind him, she could sense his movements, the swift, economical turns of his head, the way his hand, impossibly fast, went to the small, dark pistol now held with unwavering steadiness. Gunfire erupted closer now, a terrifying chorus of cracks and whines. Bullets began to chip the masonry around her head, tiny explosions of dust and stone, stinging her cheek with their debris. She gasped, a small, involuntary whimper escaping her lips, but Zane didn't flinch. His body remained an absolute shield. He fired back, not in a wild spray, but with brutal precision. Each shot was deliberate, controlled, aimed with deadly intent. She heard a choked cry from outside, then a heavy thud in the snow. His focus was absolute, terrifying in its singular intensity. He was a machine, designed for this moment, for this violence, all for her. She could feel the raw, unadulterated power emanating from him, the sheer, ferocious fury with which he was fighting. He broke bones, fired shots, used the darkness and the swirling snow to his advantage. A phantom of death in the storm. She was utterly terrified of the world outside, of the men trying to reach her, but pressed against Zane, enveloped by his lethal embrace, she felt an inexplicable, profound safety. His power, once a source of her humiliation, was now her impenetrable armor. He was hers, and she was his. And in this blizzard of blood, she was utterly, irrevocably safe within his terrifying dominion. The last mercenary fell with a strangled cry, a dark heap in the swirling snow. The blizzard, as if acknowledging the end of the battle, began to subside. its furious roar softening to a mournful sigh. Zane stood over the defeated, his broad chest heaving, dark stains blooming on his suit. Blood, not all his own, matted his dark hair, and a jagged cut bled freely on his temple. He was bruised, battered, and utterly victorious. His back remained a solid, unyielding shield for Violet, who was still pressed against the cold stone wall, trembling, her breath catching in her throat. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of gunpowder. She watched him, her eyes wide, as he slowly, deliberately turned from the battlefield. He was a force of raw, untamed power, lethal and magnificent, and he had done it all for her. In the quiet aftermath, the terrifying reality of his ferocity, the sheer brutality he had unleashed to protect her, settled deep within her. And yet, there was no fear of him, only a profound, dizzying sense of absolute safety. Just as the last flakes of snow drifted silently to the ground, a new sound cut through the silence, the low rumble of powerful engines. Through the newly cleared drive, a convoy of sleek black cars bearing the unmistakable royal insignia of Eldoria glided silently to a halt. The doors opened with a soft click, and out stepped a delegation of royal envoys, their formal attire pristine against the snow. Their faces were stern, their expressions impassive, their presence radiating an authority that felt utterly cold after the brutal warmth of Zane's protection. The lead envoy, a tall man with a carefully sculpted beard, stepped forward. His voice, crisp and formal, cut through the quiet. "Princess Violetta, your safety is now assured. We have secured your uncle's operatives. You are to return to the palace immediately. Arrangements have been made for a safe, politically advantageous engagement that will stabilize the kingdom." Violet's gaze flickered from the cold, unfeeling faces of the envoys to Zane. A safe, loveless engagement, a return to the gilded cage she had fled. The words were a stark, chilling reminder of the life she had escaped. A life of duty untainted by genuine feeling, a life without the fierce, protective embrace of the man who now stood before her, covered in snow and blood, his chest still heaving. Zane turned fully to face her then, and for the first time his cold mask shattered. The grim determination in his eyes gave way to a raw, aching vulnerability that stunned her. His dark gaze, usually so controlled, was now wide, searching, filled with an emotion she couldn't name, but felt deep in her soul. He was bruised and bleeding, his strength momentarily spent, yet his entire being was focused on her choice, and then he did something that utterly stole her breath. Slowly, deliberately, Zane Wolfe, the brutal CEO, the formidable force of nature who commanded empires and demanded absolute obedience, sank to one knee in the pristine snow. It wasn't an act of subservience, not to her crown, but an act of profound, gut-wrenching devotion, a raw, primal plea from a man who had never begged for anything in his life, his voice rough with exhaustion and a vulnerability she'd never imagined, was barely a whisper against the vast, silent landscape. "Stay with me," he asked, not demanded. It was a plea, a choice offered, not imposed. Violet's heart fractured, then swelled. She looked from the rigid, expectant faces of the envoys, whose offers of safety felt like another form of imprisonment, to Zane. He was kneeling in the snow, offering her not a kingdom, but his protection, his brutal heart, and a future where she could finally choose her own path, a future of dangerous, exhilarating freedom by his side. She moved then, not towards the envoys, not towards the sterile safety of a loveless crown, but towards him. Her eyes, shining with unshed tears, were fixed solely on Zane. She walked past the stiff, formal figures of her past, their pronouncements fading into an insignificant hum. She reached him, her fingers still trembling, gently lifting his chin, forcing him to meet her gaze. His eyes, dark and vulnerable, held hers, a silent question. She took his bloody hand, her touch surprisingly steady, a silent promise. Her voice, when it came, was clear and authoritative, resonating with a newfound strength. A queen choosing her own destiny. "Stand down," she commanded the bewildered envoys, her gaze never leaving Zane's. "I choose him." Weeks bled into a new reality, a quiet storm after the blizzard of blood. The lakeside estate, once a battleground, was now a sanctuary, fortified not just by steel and alarms, but by the fierce, unyielding will of Zane Wolfe. The world had erupted with her story, of the runaway princess, the maid in hiding, the cold CEO who had fought a war for her. But Zane's power, boundless and absolute, had acted like a shield, insulating her from the relentless media storm, from the probing questions, from any further intrusion. He had handled it all, dismantling the narrative, controlling the information flow with the same brutal efficiency he used in his boardrooms. Violet watched him, sometimes from a distance, sometimes from the intimate space beside him, as he orchestrated the final moves of his intricate game. His evidence, irrefutable and damning, had exposed her uncle's treason to the world, leading to his swift downfall and imprisonment. Her kingdom, Eldoria, now stable under a new, trusted regent, had accepted her public relinquishment of the throne. It was a choice born of true desire, embraced not with regret, but with a profound sense of liberation. She was finally free. She was no longer Princess Violetta, burdened by a crown and duty. She was no longer Violet Vance, the clumsy maid, hiding in plain sight. She was simply his. The realization settled deep within her, a truth that was both humbling and incredibly empowering. She moved through the estate with a newfound confidence, her steps lighter, her posture straighter. Her softness, once a vulnerability, was now cherished, not exploited. It was a paradox she had come to understand. Within his formidable strength, she found her own. Zane, though still a titan of industry, feared and respected across global markets, was demonstrably softer around her. The ice in his dark eyes had melted, replaced by a warmth that was almost startling in its intensity. His commands, once blunt and unforgiving, were now laced with an undeniable affection, his demands tempered by a devotion that manifested in 1,000 small, unspoken ways. He still expected her to follow his lead, to trust his decisions, but now it felt less like an imposition and more like a shared understanding, a dance of power and protection where she willingly yielded to his formidable strength, knowing it was always in her best interest. He had eliminated the threat, not just to her life, but to their future. He had torn down an old world to build a new one, a future together. She accepted her place by his side, not as a prisoner, but as a queen in his domain, ruling over his brutal heart, not a kingdom. The safety she felt in his presence was absolute, an unwavering certainty that settled deep in her bones. She was protected, cherished, and utterly, irrevocably his, and in that she found a love she had never dared to dream of, a love untainted by power, forged in the fires of his fierce, protective desire. The scent of crayons and warm cookies filled the air, a melody of children's laughter echoing off walls adorned with brightly colored drawings. Violet Vance, no longer a princess in hiding, nor a maid in a gilded cage, smiled as she helped a small boy carefully glue glitter onto a cardboard star. This was her kingdom now, a sunlit kindergarten classroom, vibrant and alive, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile elegance of Zane Wolfe's penthouse. On her left hand, a simple silver band gleamed, a quiet promise of a future she had chosen, far removed from the heavy weight of a tiara. This was the life she had secretly longed for, a life of simple freedom and love, untainted by the machinations of power. She knew this profound peace, this cherished existence, was a direct testament to the formidable man who had torn down her old world to build her this new one. Zane's foundation had quietly funded this local school, a silent acknowledgement of her deepest desires. She was safe here, utterly protected, free from the whispers of political intrigue and the looming shadow of a forced marriage. Her past, once a constant threat, was now a distant memory, held at bay by his relentless will. Outside this cozy haven, Zane Wolfe remained the brutal titan, feared in international boardrooms, his global empire expanding with an almost terrifying efficiency. Foreign dignitaries, once scornful of his refusal to claim a princess, now grudgingly tolerated him, recognizing the undeniable, unyielding power of a man who bent the world to his will. He was a force to be reckoned with, a king without a crown, but for Violet he was simply hers. A subtle shift in the classroom's energy, a sudden hush among the children as their gazes lifted towards the doorway, signaled his arrival. Violet's heart gave a familiar flutter, a soft recognition of his presence even before she turned. He stood framed in the archway, a towering figure in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his usual aura of formidable power momentarily softened by the sight of her and the small, eager faces of the children. His dark eyes, usually cold and assessing, held a warmth that was reserved only for this room, for her. He offered the children a rare, almost imperceptible, gentle smile, a sight few in his corporate world would ever witness. He walked towards her, his long strides commanding the space, yet his movements were uncharacteristically unhurried, almost deferential, as he navigated around tiny chairs and scattered toys. Violet felt the familiar pull of his presence, the quiet strength that had become her anchor. She felt a deep, abiding sense of security, a profound comfort in his imposing shadow. His dominance, once intimidating, was now a source of unwavering protection, a silent promise that she would always be safe within his sphere. When he reached her, the children momentarily forgotten in their quiet awe, he paused. Then, in a gesture that still stole her breath, Zane Wolfe, the man who commanded empires, who bowed to no one, slowly sank to one knee in the midst of the colorful chaos of her classroom. His gaze, dark and intense, was fixed solely on her, a silent, profound declaration that resonated deep within her soul. It was not an act of subservience to a crown, for she wore none. It was an act of absolute devotion to her, the woman who owned his brutal heart. He reached for her hand, his large, powerful fingers gently enclosing hers. He lifted it to his lips, his touch firm yet tender, and kissed her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. The warmth of his lips, the silent intensity of his gaze was a profound declaration, a reaffirmation of his unending devotion. In that moment, surrounded by the innocent laughter of children, Violet felt cherished, utterly safe, and eternally under his powerful, protective dominion. She was no longer a princess, no longer a maid. She was simply his, and in his fierce, unyielding love, she had found her true kingdom. If you enjoyed this story, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to Tales of Power and Desire to keep up with our intense romances.